Hi there, welcome back to our video for Module 2. We are going to be talking about trauma stewardship a little bit today. Before we officially launch in, just want you to take a moment to reflect back on how your first attempt at building a self-care activity into your day or your evening went. Hopefully you had the opportunity to do that. And if not, you have the opportunity to reflect back on what got in your way and then maybe how you can make changes moving forward to allow you to be successful in building it in.
And just a reminder again, as we talked briefly about in Module 1, if everything fell apart because of something that was happening in your family, that's okay too. This is another module, another try, so we keep at it. And again, as you keep going through this, as both Rebecca and I've reflected many times, you will have a lot of stumbling blocks. It won't be that easy. I tried it yesterday, it was great. I'm going to do it again today, it was great. It's never that easy. So once again, don't be too hard on yourself.
True. Okay, so in Module 1, we talked a lot about burnout and compassion fatigue. And so Wanda also mentioned that if you are experiencing burnout or compassion fatigue, that doesn't mean you need to be done. Doesn't mean you need to be done with your job. Doesn't mean you need to be done with your practice of social work or other mental health profession. There is a way to shift that, and self-care is one of the ways to shift that, but we wanted to kind of provide some sort of a framework for what that could also look like. And so wanted to introduce to you the term or the topic of trauma stewardship. Some of you may be very familiar with it. It may be new for others. It is from this book that I have a little picture of it here, but I also have it here on my desktop. It's called Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. It's by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky and Connie Burke. In just a bit, we're going to be watching a video from Laura Vandernoot Lipsky. She's much more eloquent at kind of summing up what trauma stewardship is, but we will provide a little bit of background and framework here. So the overarching message from this book is that after bearing witness to others' suffering, you can, and I would say you will, become fundamentally changed. It will become a part of you. And this is where it can change the way that you view life and that you react to situations. So Wanda and I are going to be talking with you a little bit about, again, how do we start tuning in and start understanding how what we're being exposed to in our work and in our larger communities, how is that changing the way that we're seeing the world, how our systems are navigating the ups and downs of our days, and how we're then able to stay present or interact with our families, our communities, our friends, all of those sorts of things. And this also connects back with that metaphor that we started using in the first module of keeping your light lit. So in order to do the work that you do and to share your light, the reason why you came to the work that you do, you really need a continual spark or a passion to do the work. So we therefore need to find ways to refuel our light. And we need to stay in touch with that heart that was breaking, that really being able to stay open, compassionate, empathetic to the work that we're doing, and to learn to care for our breaking heart, because our hearts do break and will break when we are working with clients and there aren't resources, or they are diagnosed with terminal illnesses, or accidents happen, or difficulties emerge. And we also need to learn how to help that heart heal. So if we're constantly breaking our heart, but we're not learning how to heal it, we become depleted. We experience compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and it gets in the way of us being able to do our work. And again, as Lipsky and Burke say, our light will burn out, or we build up walls and we numb out. We'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward.
One of the things I do just want to share is, having done this work for a long time, that, and I mentioned this in the first module a little bit about this notion of really wanting to try to help everybody, is one of the things that I've learned is some of the toughest stories that I've heard, or some of the toughest bearing witnesses I've heard, I was able to realize, not immediately, but at a later point, that all they really wanted from me was to tell their story. And I think sometimes we think we should have an answer, we should help make it better. And sometimes when we are bearing witness, that's all our clients or our folks need from us. They want to tell it and have us listen to it without judgment. So sometimes being there, being present, being available, having our light is all they really need from us. So sometimes we need to step back and think about that. Our role really is not to change folks' lives or give them answers. It's sometimes just to be beside them as they're walking that journey. So I ask you to think about this as Rebecca talks more about this today.
Absolutely. So the goal of trauma stewardship is to be able to engage oppression and trauma by caring for, tending to, and responsibly guiding other beings who are struggling, while not internalizing other struggles or assuming them as our own. So finding some way around that empathy, that compassion that we feel for other people, having strong enough boundaries to be able to be there, as Wanda's saying, to sit with them, to walk alongside them, but not internalizing what's happening for them as our own stories or as our own struggles. And that, I can speak for myself here, is a significant challenge for me. I'm really good at being that open sponge, that heart-to-heart connector. I'm not great about not having it like invade my whole being.
It's also one of the things that I see happen is we often have less and less support or supervision or mentors or other folks in the work we do that we can talk to and bounce these things off of. And sometimes some of the toughest work, although it's in many different areas, but for example, hospice or in hospital settings or end of life, sometimes we're the only social service worker and we don't often have those colleagues. So the other piece of this really is sometimes we need to be reminded of how we can let this go or how we're carrying that burden. So think about that as well as you begin to make this plan for yourself. One of the things we do talk about is who can you talk to? And sometimes that's in your personal life, but also in your professional life. Who is that individual or group of individuals? Sometimes we need more than one that we also can talk with when we're beginning to carry some of these burdens.
For sure. Yeah, and I would say that I know in my some previous roles that I've been in, just as Wanda says, I've been the only social worker on the team. My supervisor has been someone from a different discipline, and I really missed some sort of warning signs of things coming up for me, but also some things going on with my clients that then kind of like I had a domino effect and some worrisome or some issues emerged in that role or in my support of a role because I didn't have somebody who could kind of look at things in a similar way or be able to help me process through in a way that I might have needed to. So we'll talk in future modules about who those support people are. But if they're not organically in your support system, you really want to find somebody else that has the same lens as you and can kind of pick up on some of the same cues as you might need them to help you stay, kind of in alignment with the work that you want to do and with your own self-care. So how do you achieve trauma stewardship? We're going to be kind of talking this through for the next 3 modules, but really there's a few different aspects of it. The first one is to acknowledge the effects of the trauma exposure. So I'm hoping that that is something that has been, introduced to you all either through your MSW education or through your other mental health or your work, that there is some recognition that the work that we do is hard and that it's likely going to impact us on some level. But what's really important for you is to kind of take a personal inventory of where are all the places in your life that trauma exposure is happening. So you want to think about your own personal history, know your story, understand what you've been witness to, what your nervous system has adapted to, and also what currently are the kinds of things or the kinds of stories that activate you. So I think we shared in module 1, I really protect myself from news stories. I don't watch the news, and I sometimes will look at things online. If I hear something that I think I need to be more aware of, I will go and look and seek that out. But I really try to protect myself from the bombardment of stories that I don't need to be engaged with or impacted by, because it becomes overwhelming for me and for my system. So just you want to be thinking about kind of what are the things that activate you and that you might need to take intentional steps to kind of limit yourself around.
And I do just want to say, as we talk about this today, this whole notion of trauma stewardship is a newer concept that's been introduced. And what we are seeing is more and more social work programs are introducing trauma throughout their curriculum, right? We're embedding it. But some of you, maybe like myself, or maybe even Rebecca, earned our MSW when we weren't talking about that in the same degree. So if you're sitting in this training and think these are new things, that's exactly why you're here with us. And even if it was embedded, sometimes we lose touch of that as we become immersed in the work we're doing. So again, I just want to kind of reiterate the trauma stewardship. And I love the definition that Rebecca gave. And to remember, it's about hearing all these stories and figuring out how we can stay healthy and keep our light lit. So it's that simple. And it's not something when I earned my MSW that we ever talked about. So it may be a newer concept for you. So we hope you open and embrace it and give it some time to think about.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, because even some of the trauma courses that I think we offer in our program and that I've been involved in other, in other trainings, we are often talking about trauma and its impact on the clients that we're working with. And I think that we're still not quite where I hope that we end up being, where we're also talking about the trauma that we experience and we've experienced in our own personal lives, and then how that impacts our work, but then also how the work that we do also, it leads to trauma exposure as well. So I think that's a really good point, that I think that we're coming along, and we're constantly making strides towards this. And I hope that some of that piece of the trauma courses that are introduced in our program and others start to infuse some pieces of the impact of trauma on the practitioner as well. So.
And just one more piece and I'll let you move on.
Yeah.
I do agree. Yesterday, or in module 1, when we talked about this whole idea of adding self-care to the code of ethics, it really is a newer movement over the last, say, 10 years, where we've really started to say, what does a social worker need? For me, the first 25 years of my career was always focused completely on the client. And as we talked about, even the notion of burnout, it was kind of shameful for you, or compassion fatigue, you were supposed to figure it out. And again, even the code of ethics, for so many years, I've heard when you bring it up, the first thing everybody says is confidentiality, right? It's always about the client, and it should be. That's why we do the work. But it is time that we give some fair ground to the work you do and how this impacts you. So absolutely, I think what Rebecca's saying, and I think even as educators, we're getting better to begin to get our feet around this, or our head around this, and figure out how do we leave space open. And again, I think the pandemic did a lot of this for us as well. It opened this door. But how do we begin to really spend some time? I've said throughout my career, it's interesting how we went to school, we learned all these skills to help our clients deal with trauma, deal with everything they've gone through, to begin to figure out ways that they can function and be healthier in society. But we so often forget to think about, how could we maybe use those? How can we look in the mirror? How can we take all the skills we have and say, how does this relate to me? We are not naturally healthy individuals. And again, what we're saying here is, given everything we hear, even if we brought all of our baggage, this is going to add to it. So it is time that we begin to think about that reflection and looking at ourselves. So
yeah. And I do want to acknowledge, some people might be really good at that, right? They might be able to learn some strategy, and they might be able to say, okay, I'm also going to embed this into my own self-care and how I take care of myself. But Wanda and I have talked a lot about this. Neither one of us naturally, we're really good at going and thinking about, oh, I could help with this, and I'll incorporate it here, here, and here. And we forget to incorporate it for ourselves. So that's why we're always reminding ourselves and each other that, oh, we could use this for ourselves too. So in addition to understanding in your personal world, like what those trauma exposures are, we also want you to be thinking about it within your organization. So the agency that you're working with, the agencies that you might be interacting with as well. Think about what the trauma exposure is there. Again, do an inventory there. Is it from the clients? Is it from the agency itself? Toxic work environment, something like that. Is it, your caseloads, the lack of funding? Like, what are the pieces of it that are kind of bring up some of those more challenging pieces? Do you get health insurance? Do you get paid time off? All of those pieces lead up to it. And then again, you want to be kind of like, so we went from the micro, then we went to the meso. Now we're going all out to the macro of like societal trauma exposure. So what we are right now in the United States living through a time where there's a lot of polarization, a lot of strong feelings, views, movements on both ends of the spectrum. And it's hard to navigate that. And it's hard to regulate your own opinions and beliefs amongst that. So be thinking about that, all of the differing views that we're all being exposed to, the stigmas that we continue to be exposed to. Just yesterday, there was, a really impactful on higher education, a decision made by our Supreme Court. A few months ago, there was another, huge, decision made in our Supreme Court. We're constantly being, our systems are being introduced to these really impactful changes, for better or worse. And so you just need to be aware of how, when you hear this news or you hear these things, how it's impacting you on your day-to-day. Our healthcare systems, our housing systems, all of it. It's a lot. It's a lot to have on your shoulders every day, for sure. So as you're kind of starting to peel the layers back and do what I, again, call this personal inventory of trauma exposure, we want you, hopefully, to not get overwhelmed. Number one, I guess I would say, so take your time, practice self-care through it. If you start to do your inventory and you're like, whoa, this is a lot, slow yourself down, take a break, come back to it. But we also hope that you'll be really curious about it and that you're kind of fascinated by like, whoa, this is interesting. This isn't like, not to kind of take some of the judgment words out of it, this is horrible, or this is, whatever, but this is kind of interesting. We don't want you to be critical about like, oh my gosh, what a mess I am. I have all these things going on in my life. I was completely unaware. Like that's what we do, right? We just kind of try and push through. So you don't have to come to any particular conclusions. You don't have to give a judgment. You don't have to prescribe yourself anything about this. You don't have to try to be defensive or to make excuses or rationalize anything. It really is just kind of a curiosity exercise of what traumas you're being exposed to. And then in addition to that, just kind of wondering out loud to yourself, or maybe not out loud, maybe on a paper, or maybe you do your own kind of reflection on this. But if you're exposed to suffering in a single moment, right? So the sufferings that we might have moment to moment with a client or in our own personal lives, but also over the arc of time, is there a possibility that I'm going to be affected by this exposure? Am I being affected by this exposure? Could I potentially be affected by this exposure? And what do I want to do about it?
And I think just one last piece of that, when Rebecca talks about, going easy on yourself, not being critical. Once again, I would bring back in this notion as social workers, we are non-judgmental with our clients and no matter what they bring to us. And again, I would ask that we turn that around and we're non-judgmental with ourselves. And we're kind to ourselves as we would be with anybody else that says, oh, look what I did.
So the second piece of how you can work towards achieving trauma stewardship is to really start tuning in. Again, I talked in module 1 about starting to turn inwards and really, instead of listening to everything that's coming up for our clients or within our agencies, but really start tuning into what's coming up in ourselves, what tapes are being played, what are our initial reactions to things. And then also, like, that's kind of like the first layer, but if we can kind of settle and get grounded, we can even go a layer beyond that to learn about what is our system asking for from us and what wisdom do we have within our system that can allow us to understand what we need to do to heal and what those self-care strategies are that are going to be able to help us manage and tolerate what's coming at us. So again, it's really kind of tuning in, hearing and acknowledging and gaining some awareness around what's coming up for you. And then, instead of pushing that out and pushing it away and trying to deny it, sitting with it and then seeing, giving some time and space and some energy around what might emerge as wisdom about how do you help that? How do you heal whatever's coming up for you? And then lastly is to continue to live fully. So I think that's the ultimate goal, right? Is that our nervous systems come into that state of equilibrium where we're able to respond and act appropriately in a way that we feel good about, and we can practice ethically, and we can do all those things. We can kind of flow in and out naturally of all of the different things that happen in our worlds, and don't, overreact to anything, don't get stuck in anything, that we really have a level of fluidity and flow in our lives. Because the reality is that when we lack resources and means to help others reach their goals, this can increase our clients' distress and create increased hardship for them. So I think that we can all agree that we went into this work on some level and in some way to help others, right? But the bottom line is that when we are empty, or when we're depleted, or when we're exposed to so much trauma that we are no longer able to flow, we get stuck, we overreact, we're dysregulated, then that increases the hardship for our clients, versus giving them that place that Wanda was talking about being able to walk alongside of them in a regulated manner. So want you to start thinking about, this is going to be part of the reflection journal that you do towards the end of this module, but we're going to talk a little bit about, okay, so how do I know that I'm being impacted by the trauma, the exposure to the trauma? In the book, they kind of outline these 16 warning signs. So I'm going to ask you to, as we're kind of going through this, for you to be thinking a little bit about, oh yeah, I've seen that in myself, or I've seen that in other people that I'm working with, and get a little curious about this. I will go through many of these, but also you can always pause this and look through this further. We'll also hopefully have a handout in this module that has these 16 warning signs as well for you, that you can print out and you can keep and you can reflect back on. So feeling helpless or hopeless, like what's the point? Why am I doing this work? We'll talk in later modules about that. For me, when that tape starts playing in my head, that's a really good indicator to me that some things are going on for me, and I need to kind of like slow down and take a look about what's coming up for me. That sense that one can never do enough, and that if you don't do it, it's not going to get done. I have to say I'm very guilty of this one also. So feeling like you're the only one who can do it right? Or you're the only one who's going to do it. So just be aware of that when it comes up, that maybe you're being exposed to too many things.
I do want to say, as Rebecca's going through these, that this is not about thinking you're diagnosing yourself or something. And again, I will say, just like Rebecca said, I have been I can see myself in almost every one of these at different points. So please, if you see those, again, this is an example that we've all likely been touched by trauma or had trauma exposure at some point. And so I encourage you, as we're reading these, and like Rebecca kind of joked about that again, I think we often have this sense that we should be above this, and we're not. We're human beings. And again, we come to this work because we have this need to, or this want to, make the world a better place, to help individuals. And sometimes we take what we hear and we don't realize how deeply it does sometimes dim our light, touch our hearts, all of those things. So if you see yourself in this, we all do. And again, no judgment around this. Let's keep thinking about it and think about how it's impacted us.
Yep. I love that. For me, I think of these as like, these are like a message, like a flag coming up to me, like, hey, I'm here, and I want you to pay attention to me, and what can you do to kind of help simmer things down, because we're a little activated. So I look at these as like, they can be a gift. It doesn't feel like a gift when we're acting out of these things, but it can be if you can catch yourself, or somebody else can, hold that mirror up for you and say, hey, have you taken a look at this? Are you doing okay? What can we help you with? Those sorts of things. So hypervigilance, like being like really activated all the time, being on edge, being so focused in your job that you really can't be present for other things, and that you're always kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop, the next crisis, the next emergency for you to like sweep in and take over and take control. I see myself in that one too. So, diminished creativity for some of us, when we get kind of really activated, that we kind of aren't able to stay in tune with that creative side of us. We might become really bored or uninterested in some of the tasks that we're doing. And we also have a really hard time remembering a time when we felt creative or energized in our work. And so that gets back to that point that I had talked about a little bit about in module 1, that you're going to be creating a plan in module 4. And part of that reason for that is for this exact thing. When you can't remember a time when things were good, or when you were able to be creative or in your flow or feeling good, that you have this plan that you can go back to. Because for whatever reason, the way that our brains work is sometimes we're kind of, we do all or none thinking, like, well, if I'm bored now, I've always been bored, or if I can't be creative now, I've never been able to be creative, those kinds of things. And that gets to that inability to embrace the complexity, or the seeing things that you only see things as good or bad, black or white, fixable or non-fixable, tolerant or not tolerant, tolerable or not tolerable, those kinds of things, that you're not able to see that, you know, we're always constantly flowing in and out of things, and ease and dis-ease.
And so much of life is gray, not black and white, and just being reminded of that. Yes.
Absolutely. Minimizing things. Oh, well, you know, at least I didn't get shot in my job today, so it could be worse. Yeah, that is you. Absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, I do think that there is something to be said for being able to have perspective, but when you're minimizing the truth of your exposure to the trauma, that isn't helpful. So you want to be kind of thinking about that. So chronic exhaustion, physical ailments, if you're feeling fatigue, and Wanda talked about this, like feeling it in your bones and every cell of your body, and any task that you bring yourself to, you're just slugging through the mud. That's a flag for you. Your inability to listen, or your deliberate avoidance of things. So how many times have you called somebody and their mailbox is full, right? And you wonder, oh, do they just not know, or is this intentional? Do they not want to have any more information coming at them? Or perhaps you're like going to do a home visit and you like knock really softly, and fingers crossed they don't hear, they don't come to the door, and they're not there, and you're not going to have to do the visit. So be thinking about that. I know that's come up for me sometimes, like my phone will ring at work and I'm like, I don't think I have what I need to give to this person who's calling. And so you avoid it. So again, this happens to all of us. And if it happens on one day and then the next day you bounce back and you're all good, it's not an issue. It's when it becomes kind of like I've talked about, when you get a little stuck in this, or it becomes a pattern. And more times than not, you're in this place of, I don't want to answer that phone because I don't want to have to deal with it. Also dissociative moments. So you're engaged in your work, and then for whatever reason, you just become unhinged, or that you might realize that you haven't been paying attention to your client for the last 5 minutes. Sometimes this happens to me when I'm like driving home and I like pull into my driveway and I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't remember the last 10 minutes of my drive. That can be okay, but it can also, depending on where and when it happens, it might not be okay. So if you're doing it with your clients, if it's like very upsetting to you, or something happens that's like unsafe, then you really want to immediately take action on it. But just notice, like, how much is your brain kind of shutting down, and are you just zoning out, and is it impacting your ability to function?
Right. And I think even, you know, the notion of something unhinges you. I mean, again, one of my red flags, as Rebecca said, is sometimes when I feel like I have less patience, I tend to have a lot of patience for people around me. I'm so forgiving of everybody. But when I have days when I begin to, you know, be frustrated about little things, and I stop and think about it, and I think that's not something I would normally be frustrated. So all of those pieces, you know, again, keeping in mind, because that's when it reminds us that things are building. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then this sense of persecution. So feeling like that you have a lack of ability to control your own life and what's happening to you. And you feel that others are responsible for our satisfaction. So I've seen this quite a bit. I don't know that I tend to fall in this one as frequently, but this is a really common one, that those around us that like, oh, well, if our country or our government would just do X, Y, or Z, we would have no problems. Or if our boss would just do X, Y, or Z, then this agency would function fine. So just being listening, like, to how many times and in how many areas of your life are you saying those things? That's a sign for you that your system is overexposed. So guilt, I know this has happened to me. How can I spend money on a new purse or buy a new car or get, a new something for my child when I know that the people I'm working with maybe can't even afford their light bill or are homeless or going to be, sleeping in a shelter tonight. So think about that. Think about how many times those things are coming up for you in your life, and how are you working through that? How are you managing that? Are you pushing it down? Are you denying yourself of those things in life because you feel bad about it? Like, how is that impacting you? And then being fearful. So having these intense feelings, feeling like you're personally vulnerable, feeling like you may be being a victim to some of either the clients that you're working with, the systems that you're working in. If that starts to occupy the space within you, or if that starts to kind of play in that tape in your head of that I'm unsafe and what I'm doing isn't safe, and that I'm like potentially wherever I go, I'm going to get hurt. I heard someone say, like, we're being exposed to so much gun violence right now in our country that people are thinking about, and I can say this happens to me too. You're going on a walk, you're bringing your trash out, whatever, and you're thinking, am I going to get shot? Could I get shot? Is it likely that I'm going to get shot? So be thinking about that. If that's coming up for you, that's some awareness for you that exposure to those kinds of things, your system is kind of maxed out, flooded out to that. So how can you protect yourself around some of that? Anger and cynicism. So when you see the suffering and maybe experience it yourself, it's hard to not want revenge. So like you think about some of this comes out in some of our social movements, right? Is that like something bad happens and we want to exact revenge on it. It again, is one to talk about healthy humor is okay, but when you start to use some of that darker humor, or when it's used to kind of like target at vulnerable people, you want to be thinking about that, or even people in power, right? Like that if you're having to attack or to bring someone down in order for you to feel equalized, that's kind of a problem, right? Because we hopefully as social workers, we want to work for everybody's benefit, and not just be thinking about like the chosen and the not chosen. So then the inability to empathize, or when you numb out. So it's basically you just kind of are falling emotionally asleep. And again, that is often a result of being overwhelmed over a period of time and just not having the ability to like flow in and out of things anymore. Like your system is just taxed. So in connection with numbing out, we often use addictions to numb out. So we use alcohol, we use food, we use sex, we use video games, maybe scrolling through Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, watching a lot of TV, whatever those things are. We all likely, engage in all of these things. And it's not a problem unless it becomes like it's impacting your ability to flow in and out of feelings, or it's impacting your daily functioning. So if we're calling out of work because we want to sit home and scroll through TikTok all day, then there's a flag for you. And then also grandiosity. So feeling like only you can solve someone's problems. We talked a little bit about that before. Becoming that powerful figure in another's life, that savior in another person's life, or getting attached to the feeling of being needed. So if you feel like your self-worth is part of, is now kind of tangled up in your clients needing you and you being able to fix or help their situation, then those are all, again, if that's kind of the tape playing in your head, that's a flag for you that you need to kind of pay attention to what's coming up. So just again, a recap of what you can do. You can understand the systems that you're in, so that take that inventory of trauma exposure. You can recognize your role and how you might be giving power to that role within the system, and kind of giving permission for it to be exposed to some of that trauma. And then you can start to build self-care into all the systems, your personal life, your professional world, and then maybe whatever other aspects, your community world as well. It's like, how do you start to build in some of these self-care protective factors into your world?
And I just want to add to this, one of the purposes of this training that we're talking with you all about over the 4 modules is this notion of how do you build a self-care plan. So to build the self-care plan, so again, your physical and your mental health well-being, you're in a good place. But I also encourage you, for example, even with this trauma exposure, to revisit some of this at different points in your lives. Because again, depending on the job, depending on our stability and where we are in the community, depending on our own health, our mental health, we're in different places at different times. And I say that because, again, I brought this up in the first module. When the pandemic hit, I had been in the field for a long time, and it was something that I described it for me for quite a period of time where I felt like the ground was tilted. I can only equate that to when I lost my mother about 12 years ago. I felt like it was a different world. And when the pandemic, it was something we could, to even imagine, I say this because to even imagine somebody saying, tomorrow we're going to shut the world down. We're going to shut down restaurants. We're going to shut down, all of it, never having done anything like that before in this country or across the country. You can't fly places. You're going to be stuck. I mean, you can't go to this, you can't go to that. And I think that was such a time for us that it made us realize that we've got to rethink about how we do this. And I hope we never encounter anything like that again. But I think the notion, if you do this, and we said, if you say, I am really doing well with this, first of all, I applaud you because there's not all of us are doing great with this. But I think revisiting, because if you're struggling with some parts of it, you can be struggling with different parts. And as Rebecca went through those 16 points, there's some of those. And I think, well, even just last week, that piece, I got hung up a little bit. And so, but it can help us, kind of like I always say, I was going to say, I don't have it right in front of me here, but the code of ethics that I keep on my desk, we revisit that. Sometimes having, and I don't know if we've ever talked about this in our plan at the end, Rebecca, but the notion of not just how is your plan working, but revisiting some of these trauma responses, because even if we have a good plan and we're falling into this because of the stories we're hearing or the burdens we're carrying, it'll disrupt all of that. So, again, whether you buy the book or the other thing, as you go through this, I am a bit newer to technology, but even different parts of that, taking a snapshot if you want, and then, printing that out, or some of these pieces to say, let me revisit this at a different point. So.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And the slides all of our slides will be in this module hopefully in module 1, you'll get the whole slide deck as well. So revisit it. That's a good suggestion. All right, so we're going to take the next, I think this video is 18 minutes or so. We're going to watch this video with you. We'll kind of debrief a bit for you and hopefully help you walk through a little bit of debriefing on your own. This again is a video by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. It's called Beyond the Cliff, and this is related to trauma stewardship. So like I said, she'll be very eloquently taking us through kind of what that means and what that can look like.
18 years ago, I found myself standing on top of a very tall cliff, having what I would only come to recognize many years later as a near psychotic break. It would be fair for you to ask if I had always been that on edge, and the answer is no. But as many of you, I imagine, can relate to, how I found myself on top of that cliff on that particular day was by way of a very long road. Like so many others, my childhood was filled with a lot of love and many challenges. Life came into particularly sharp focus for me when I was 10 years old. My mom, who was the healthiest person any of us knew, went into a doctor's appointment for what everyone thought would be a diagnosis of pneumonia at the worst, and returned home having been told she had a very rare form of lung cancer. They gave her 3 months to live. She lived for 3 years, much of that time with one lung. And so she died when I was 13, and the sun rose and set with my mom, and I entered into my adolescence feeling if continuing to live wasn't going to be impossible, it was going to be highly improbable. So I navigated high school with a lot of overachieving. I spent my days getting straight A's and working 3 jobs, and I spent my nights planning on how I could end my life without causing my older brother, who'd always been my protector and my role model, too much pain. I did make it through high school, and then I landed in college, and I found myself sitting in one of those very large lecture halls, and my professor at the time, Professor Richard Applebaum, was talking to us about suffering on this one particular morning. In particular, he was talking about homelessness. And he was talking about it in a way that allowed time to stand still for me. He was building on what so many traditions have taught us since the beginning of time, really, that in life, it is said, there's equal measure of brutality and beauty, of pain and pleasure, of annihilating moments and of sublime moments. And yet there was a way he was talking about it, this whole conversation about equanimity, that was completely new to me. So during those 3 years when my brother and I were taking care of our mom, we were surrounded by a number of very, very loving people and kind people who gave us a lot of support for appearing to be stoic, for seeming to be strong, and for holding it all together. And what Professor Applebaum was talking about on that morning is when one is engaged in suffering, there is so much more to it than holding it all together. So what I knew was I wanted more of whatever he had going on. So I went up to him after class, asked how I could help. He scribbled on a piece of paper the name and number of our local homeless shelter's director. And that's when I started volunteering at age 18, spending the nights regularly volunteering in a homeless shelter. I went on to work with all forms of trauma, and always within this kind of larger backdrop of systematic oppression and liberation theory. And what I knew was that I was so grateful that I had found something that made sense to me and that I felt passionate about. What I had no idea, and wouldn't know for years to come, was to what degree, having borne witness to the suffering of my mom and then the subsequent years of bearing witness to so much suffering with so many people, to what degree that was taking a toll on me. And this is something that wise people have passed down for a long time, and we know more and more about now because of the advances in neuroscience and the wonderful research that many of my esteemed colleagues are doing. But at the time, I had no idea about this cumulative toll. So one of the ways that the toll can show up is for those of you who are doing work. There are folks who do work, and as a result of the work you do, you might be exposed to things, either because of the content of what you're doing, but what a lot of my colleagues say is like, look, the work itself is the least of my concern. It's all my colleagues who put me over the edge, right? So sometimes the toll is because of the work. Sometimes the toll is because of the caretaking we do on our lives. Here she's saying, I feel like I need you less and less, Mom, now that I can make myself feel guilty all on my own. So much of the toll we feel is because many, many, many of you are caretaking in your personal lives. You're caretaking those around you. You're at home tending for folks who are returning from wars, folks who are ill, people who are in need in the community. Sometimes the toll we feel is because of the suffering of other living beings. This is Chris Jordan's wonderful work. And sometimes it's because of what's going on ecologically on the planet itself. This is the work of Vance Friedenberg. He's one of the leading scientists looking at the sixth mass extinction. But what we know is that when humans are exposed to suffering, hardship, crisis, trauma of humans, other living beings, or the planet itself, there's a cumulative toll. And there's a toll on us individually, there's a toll on your immediate relationships, there's a toll organizationally for those of you who have this exposure in your work, institutionally, systemically. We see it in movements we're a part of, we're seeing it throughout all of our communities and society as a whole. She's saying, speaking personally, I haven't had my day, and I've never met any dog who has. The other piece of this that's very important, at least when I do this work, is it's always held in a larger context of systematic oppression. You know this so well, but a reminder that the degree to which you're impacted by the lives you're living and the work you're doing is intimately tied to the fact that we're in a society with so much supremacy. And if we're in a society where there's no oppression, there's no racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, classism, and xenophobia, so much of the suffering we are tending to wouldn't exist, and the remaining bits that exist in life, we would all be affected by that so differently. I have no doubt that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day, and that for those of you who know what this toll is, and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face doing that, hey Laura, you're tripping, you should take some time off. And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. You know, survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was doing God's work. You could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not gonna have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my job. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted. I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised. We took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to others suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff, and would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You know, you kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation, because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately, it was my stepfather-in-law who said, are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you? And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, whoa, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go to a playground. It's just a lovely place for children. You're not worried about like head injuries or Amber Alerts, right? So, but this is what happens, that over time, what you're exposed to affects your entire worldview. There are so many ways that we can be affected individually and collectively by exposure to vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. Many people call it many different things. But this exposure affects all of us so differently. What I have found through the privilege of getting to work with everyone from zookeepers to judges, school teachers to nurses, ecologists to activists, is that it is breathtaking, the commonalities of how one is affected, right? So some of the ways we find where you feel like you're not doing enough, right? So here they're saying we just haven't been flapping them hard enough. So this is where you feel like you're not doing enough. You constantly feel like you should be doing more, right? Another one could be morale. So they're saying, I see you've done time, so working in a cubicle shouldn't be a problem. So I work with organizations nationally, internationally, and one of the things we find so much is the morale, the very, very quickly eroding morale. Here he's saying, I bark at everything. You can't go wrong that way. So hypervigilance, many people can relate to a sense of hypervigilance. This is where you lose your ability to flow in, really fluidly in between your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. You become in kind of in hyperarousal. I had a colleague say to me, she was a child support enforcement officer, and she said to me, I can tell you which ones of my son's friends are going to grow up to not pay their child support. And her son was 5 years old, right? Here he's saying, no, not there, please, that's where I'm going to put my head. So exhaustion is something many people can relate to. And not the exhaustion before you work out, but this is an exhaustion where you are tired in your soul, you are tired in your spirit, you are tired throughout your bone marrow. All of your ancestors were tired people, right? There is the avoidance. He's saying, no, Thursday's out, how about never? Is never good for you? This is where the best part of your day at work is where you don't have to do your job, right? And then there's the avoidance in our personal lives. She's saying, it's too late, Roger, they've seen us. Cynicism, many of you can relate to. They're saying, but she'll come down eventually, and she'll come down hard. So what many of you might be able to relate to is not the pure cynicism, but the cynical humor, right? And then anger and rage. He's saying it's a new antidepressant. Instead of swallowing it, you throw it at anyone who appears to be having a good time. And here he's saying, I can cure your back problem, but there's a risk you'll be left with nothing to talk about. So the other thing we see here is the externalizing that happens when more and more people are asked to do more with fewer resources. We see this whole seduction to externalizing. So this is where you start saying to yourself, you know, I would actually be fine taking care of my loved ones if I could have different loved ones to take care of. Or people say, I would love coming to my job every day if my immediate supervisor would just retire, right? And then there's blind spots that we have. So one of the things that we notice a lot that people have is blind spots. I'll share the story to illustrate it. This is a water bottle. It says the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. It's one of approximately, over 100 water bottles I have in my home that have been gifted to me like incredible programs that many of you are involved with, right? And every water bottle I have in my home has something stenciled on the side like this, which has, domestic violence, sexual assault, HIV/AIDS, infant mortality, flood, hurricane, tornado, tsunami, death, destruction, right? And I'm just thinking, this is great. I got water bottles. Every day is Earth Day here. This is fantastic. But what it also means is these are the water bottles that go with my kids to swim meets, basketball tournaments, soccer games, right? And I'm not thinking anything of it. But then I was unpacking my child's lunch some time ago, and I noticed that at school she found the provisions to kind of hack over the word sexual, right? So she's not exactly old enough to know what sexual violence is. She's definitely old enough to know you're not sitting at the lunch table at school with a water bottle that says domestic and sexual violence on it, right? I don't know why, but I decided to tell this story at a very large conference of police officers, and when the break came, a police officer came up to me 2 centimeters from my face, $20 in her hand, and said, "Go get your kid a proper water bottle." So I feel like things have gone very wrong in life when you've got the cops giving you cash, instructing you on parenting, right? And then dogma and self-righteousness, okay? So here he's saying, your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country, and your mother doesn't. And then addictions, which many of us can relate to. She's saying, of course I drink during the day. I'm way too tired to drink at night. And numbing. So here he's saying, could we up the dosage? I still have feelings. One of the things I want to say to us about numbing, it is incredibly seductive with the volume and the intensity of suffering on the planet today. It is incredibly tempting and seductive to become numb. And what I want to offer to you is how critical it is that we continue to strive to cultivate our capacity to be present. One of the reasons we want so much to be present is we remind ourselves with everything that is out of our control every single day, one of the things that remains in our control at any given time is your ability to bring your exquisite quality of presence to what you are doing and to how you are being. That presence, we know, can interrupt the systematic oppression which is causing so much harm and can transform the trauma that is arising. It is very easy to get in that place of you have no idea what my life, if you lived here, if you did my job, if you saw what I saw, and that's when we call on our ancestors, and that's when we call on so many people who have come before us who remind us that when they could not change anything external, they were able to shift everything as a result of where they put their focus. And again, I don't know any of you personally, but the assumption I'm going to make is none of us would go up against any of these folks, right? You're not going to, oh, Desmond, I know things got rough for you in South Africa, what with apartheid and all, but here in Washington State, we got a few things going on, right? Here he's saying, this is the barn where we keep our feelings. If a feeling comes to you, bring it here and lock it up. The other reason I want to bring us back to presence is I want to remind you that while I know we have so many different life circumstances, I believe we have a shared ethic of doing no harm. If you are numb, you will not be able to gauge whether or not you're doing harm. And if we believe in what Chief Sealth talks about with the web of life, or what Martin Luther King talked about with the single garment of destiny, you all know so well that there are so many parts of this web that are profoundly compromised. And many of you are bringing heart and soul to tremendous sacrifice to tend to parts of this web that are compromised. If the way you're doing that out there means in any way you are neglecting your immediate part of the web, cutting off circulation to your immediate part of the web, lighting your immediate part of the web on fire, it is not ethical practice, it's not integrity-based practice, it's not sustainable. The other piece with numbing out, and what we've learned from so many people who've come before us and in so many traditions, is you don't get to selectively numb. So if you're gonna numb out your sorrow, you're also gonna numb out any possible happiness you can have. If you are gonna numb out the heartbreak, you're gonna numb out any ability to survive, noticing what is beautiful. And the other thing is your mind and body and spirit will keep trying to bring itself back to a full range of feelings of that whole equanimity and that spaciousness. Which means that's why, you can work on coalition after coalition of peace building, and then you get in the lunch line or on the freeway and you don't let anybody merge in front of you, right? And we defend that. We say how I conduct myself on that freeway or when I'm getting my food at lunch has nothing to do with the other work I'm doing. Howard Thurman reminds us, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go and do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So we remember that with the magnitude of suffering at play on the planet right now, we are in desperate need of folks who have the wherewithal and who have the courage to be present. We know from that place of presence, it is possible to aspire to do no harm. It is possible to transform whatever trauma arises, and it is possible to continue to work to dismantle the systematic oppression which is causing such a legacy of suffering. From that place of presence, we know that it is possible to metabolize whatever arises in life, the waves of life which will continue to present to us what they present. There is a way to metabolize that and integrate it so that over time you find that it contributes to your awakening. That the longer we get to walk on this planet, we find we have deeper compassion, vaster humility, and we are able to come up and out of the narrow places. And from that place of cultivated presence, we remember that it is possible to create and to sustain an ability to be truly transformative. Thank you.
Okay, so we're back. Wanda and I have watched that video countless number of times at this point, and I always say that there's something different that I get out of each time that I watch it. There's some kind of nugget that really speaks to wherever I am in my life at that time when I watch it. So I always just really appreciate that and I feel like I can kind of take a breath, and that I like everything's going to be okay when I listen to that. That yes, you may be impacted and all these things may be happening, and we can work on it, and we can be okay.
Absolutely. And I do agree. And I hope that you watch this video again in different ways, in different times, because I agree with Rebecca every time. Today, one of the things that I heard that I don't know if I've really listened to before is this notion of everything going on in the world. So all the other things that are happening that might be impacting us around, racism, sexism, ageism, all of these things. If we could remove all of that, but what we don't sometimes understand is what are all those things that are bearing down either on our colleague or even on us some days. And we think, well, why did I get upset about that? Well, sometimes, again, it's that cumulative effect of everything, right? And I agree. So I think sometimes when we step back, and watching this video is, to me, the personal story of somebody that was greatly impacted by trauma exposure to the point where she was carrying that with her everywhere. She could not see it. She was denying it when her colleagues were sharing it with her. And she's not saying it was so severe that I'm now, I've moved on and became, a cosmetologist. She's saying I worked on it, right? And she uses humor, which I think is fine in doing that. But I also think, even though I laugh at all of those pieces, it's important. It's also important to recognize that it is a very serious and thoughtful part of who we are as clinicians. And to hear somebody so powerful share her journey, it allows us to reflect back on some of those 16 warning signs or 16 flags and say, how is this impacting me right now?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what's really important about her humor is that it doesn't come at the expense of other people, right? So, I think that's a really important distinguishing aspect of your humor. Like if you're knocking somebody down to be funny, that's when you sort of need to say, well, I don't know if this is necessarily appropriate or that this is where I want to act out of.
Absolutely. Humor should never be at the expense of somebody else. And I just want to share, I recently had a former student say to me, she said, I remember taking your course many years ago, and one of the things you told us is being a social worker isn't something you do, it's something you become. And when she said that for a minute, my first response was, well, I'm glad she heard that. But then I thought, but do I even believe that anymore? I am not a social worker 24/7. I am not. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm, all these other things as well. And I think sometimes trying to remember that, and one of the things I hear Laura talk about is that notion she had of, she was going to like impact everything in the world all the time. And the work she was doing was God's work. And she was all consumed. So, I say to that former student, I don't know that it's somebody we become. It is our job. And I hope we take it serious, and I hope we're great at it. Rebecca and I are going to talk more in module 3 and more specifically module 4 about how do we shut off that job at some point? How do we transition from doing that tough work to going home and relaxing and as we say throughout this, and beginning to take care of ourselves. So I just want to share that, because I also think, just like Laura, as we do this work, sometimes our values, our thoughts, our passion change a bit. They don't go away, but they change. And sometimes we think about this work in different ways.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the hardest lessons that I've been working on throughout my career, and it's one that when I was in social work school, one that one of my professors tried to help us with, is that, that differentiating, like, when can we take that social work hat off and when can we give ourselves permission to? So a lot of times we're going to be in social situations where opinions that we maybe don't necessarily agree with are brought up, and our social work, our social justice lens kind of like perks up and says, what is my responsibility to engage with this? And I think that over time, we have to figure that out. We have to figure out when, where, how, and with whom we're going to take those things on, and giving ourselves permission to have boundaries and make choices around that we don't always need to be the social justice warrior in every single aspect of our life. As I said, that when I was in social work school, one of my professors really tried to get us to think about picking one realm of social work or social justice or issue happening in the world, and really kind of thinking about over your career, kind of honing in, dedicating your energies to that. And I think that is connected to what Laura's saying about really starting to tune in and figure out, like, what makes us feel alive, what kind of fuel lights our light so bright that we really can impact the world in a beautiful way. And if we try to spread ourselves thin or take every aspect of social justice on, that doesn't allow us to have the same amount of light on all of the issues, and it can really impact us. So as you're thinking about self-care over the next modules, be thinking about, like, how do you give yourself boundaries and parameters and permissions to not take everything on?
And not lose who we are as a person too.
Ding, ding, ding. Yes. So at this point, we're going to be wrapping up this module's video. But before we do that, Wanda is going to kind of share with you what you're going to find in the reflective journal and what we hope you'll think about.
So yes, as you kind of are processing a little bit of this whole video, we do want you to think about and kind of process some of that. So we're going to give you that space and time to do that. So as you look at your reflective journal, and we're nearing the end of module 2, we want you to now think about what are some of the top reasons you show up at work each day to your job. And a part of what you might want to think about, are you thinking about that a little differently than maybe you even did in module 1 when we began to say that, right? Module 1, we said, what's lighting your fire? What keeps you going every day? Why are you continuing to show up? So what are the top reasons? If they're the same as you thought about in module 1, that's fine. But take a minute and step back. I also encourage you, as you're doing these reflective journals, take the time you need. This isn't an assignment that we're going to say you got 10 minutes, go and come back. Take the time if you want to really think about that. And as you think about the top reasons, we also want you to begin to think about, as Laura was talking in the video, what are some of the top reasons you feel stressed in your work role? Beginning to really identify that. And maybe again, think back when we talked about closing your eyes and it's Monday morning. And when you're thinking those things, what are you thinking about? What causes you stress? Now, again, we're not talking about if you think about, well, why I'm stressed is next week I'm having this record review by the state or the, whatever. That's something that might happen and that's going to cause anybody stress, but your regular routine. What are the top reasons you're showing up right now? What are the top reasons you're feeling stressed during that? And again, please keep in mind that there will be a balance. I've yet to meet anybody, no matter what work they do, where there's not a balance of loving what you do and not loving every part of it. So that's a piece of this. And again, as you do this, thinking about and going back to and reviewing those 16 warning signs that Rebecca talked about trauma exposure, as you looked at those, and again, you might want to break each one out. Which ones and what came up for you around those? And thinking about, did you recognize any of those signs? One of the things that was interesting for me when Rebecca was talking about that is some of those are what we've kind of thought about in our society as good skills, right? This notion that it's up to me to take this on, or this notion, I'll kind of just, I'm the only one that can do this work, or I'm going to show up no matter what, or, Laura kind of talked about this, I'm doing God's work. And we have in a bit of a way, I think in this country, a warped sense of what our responsibility is as a social worker or as an employee. So thinking about what's coming up, do you recognize those? And if you do recognize them, do you think, is that a healthy part for you or is that not a healthy part? And can we begin to kind of explore that? And back to the video again, thinking about what struck you most in this video, what touched you. And I would say to you, if you have time in the future, relook at the video. I find, depending on what's going on in my life at that time, different parts kind of pop up for me. And there's been times, the 5th, 6th, 7th time, I'm like, that kind of went over my head the first time, but that's kind of important. There's so much. We use this because there's so much in this video that can kind of reflect for you and let you think about it. And I hope, one of the things that has been constantly there for me every time I watch it is her journey and kind of recognizing the trauma exposure and healing and continuing to do the work. So that's critical. So as you do this reflective journal, continue. We have a lot in this part. So do 1 or 2, do the first reasons you show up and not, look at the warning signs, come back and talk about the video, however you want to do that. Another reminder, the journal is yours. It's private. What you share in there is for you only. So feel free. This is about the honesty with yourself. And that can be tough sometimes. Sometimes I think it's harder to be honest with myself than others out around us. So think about that. So this is your assignment for this piece.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as we're wrapping up this module 2 video, just kind of a little nugget to leave you with, but the more deeply we connect with ourselves, the brighter our light can shine and the more joyfully, and I would also put in there ethically, we can do our work. So just kind of be thinking a little bit about that. So we're wrapping up today's video. We look forward to seeing you again in module 3. Hope this was helpful and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.